I've been asked a lot to do reviews of bread makers, and in this video I'm going to be comparing two bestsellers. One is the top of the range model from Panasonic with lots of features, and the other is a more budget model from Morphy Richards. And the aim of this video isn't just to tell you which of these two models is better, but to show you more broadly the kind of features that you might want to look for if you're considering buying any bread maker. Both of these appliances were provided by the manufacturers so I could make this video, but they don't have any input into what I say. So we'll start with the Morphy Richards Fast Bake Bread Maker. According to one review I read of this model, it's been around for apparently 15 years at least, and whenever I've checked on Amazon's bestsellers list, it's always been there hovering in the top 3 somewhere. It's a good size, not huge on the worktop, but the maximum size of loaf that it can make is £2, which is normally the biggest size loaf tin that you would consider buying if you were baking in the oven. With both of these bread makers, you'll need a spot on the worktop without cupboards overhead so that you can open them up and, more importantly, keep the lid propped open. This Morphy Richards model has got what I think is one of the most important features in a bread maker, which is a delayed start. Now, I've made bread for years without a bread maker, but the one thing that I can't do and will never be able to do is make bread in my sleep and wake up to the smell of it the next morning. So that is the big advantage of a machine over a human. You can delay the start of the bread making by up to 13 hours on both of these models. And having done that with this Morphy Richards model, I can tell you that there is nothing quite like opening the bedroom door in the morning, having briefly forgotten that you've set up the bread maker, and then being hit by this incredible smell of fresh bread coming upstairs. The delayed start, if you want to use it, is set up with the time button on the control panel. You simply add on the delay that you want, so the total is the length of time until you want the loaf to be ready. So if it's 9 o'clock at night and you want the loaf ready at 7 the next morning, you add 7 hours to a 3-hour program to get 10 hours total. There's also a button to toggle between the two loaf sizes, a start-stop button, a crust button to toggle between light, medium or dark, and a menu button to pick the program you want. There's no power switch on this model. Instead, you control the power by turning the socket at the wall on and off. The screen shows the options you've selected and a countdown timer, but it doesn't have an indicator that shows you which part of the baking process the machine has reached. However, what it does have is a window, and I'll come back later in the video and talk about whether that can be an adequate substitute for a baking progress indicator. There are 12 programs on this model, which are basic, which will do most of your day-to-day baking, French for crusty French bread, whole wheat, which has a longer preheat time to allow the grains to soak, quick, sweet, fast bake 1 and 2, dough, which you use if you want to take the dough out and make rolls, jam, cake, sandwich, and extra bake. If you're making a raisin loaf, you use the basic program, and when it beeps during the second kneading cycle, you add the raisins or nuts, depending on what you're making. And at the end of the program, there is an automatic keep warm option for an hour. The instruction books for both of these bread makers are pretty extensive. Now, I've read a lot of instruction books, but these ones are on another level, so do be prepared for that. Bread makers, in theory, make baking easier, but baking is a science and you'll need to do your homework before you make your first loaf. So I tried several different recipes and programs during the week. The 3-hour basic program produced a good white loaf and also a cheese and onion loaf. I also tried the fast bake program, which produces a loaf from scratch in under an hour, which is really fast. Now, it was pretty pale at the end of that 1-hour cooking program, but I stuck it back on to extra bake to give it 20 minutes extra to brown up. And it came out okay. The loaf wasn't as good as others, but it also took less than half the time to make. So if you did desperately need a loaf of bread, it would be very adequate. Now, like all bread makers, you end up with the blade baked into the bottom of the loaf at the end, but the blades in both of these models are pretty compact, and I could definitely live with what was quite a discreet hole that both of them were left with. One thing to mention, I did find the blade in the Morphy Richards a little bit tricky to remove, particularly if you get distracted doing other things and then you allow the pan to cool and the dough to dry around it. But on the flip side, for me, inserting the bread pan into the bread maker felt much easier on this model than it did on the Panasonic. And also, the recipes in the Morphy Richards recipe book were really reliable and produced consistently good results. And now let's look at the Panasonic. This is the SDYR2540, which is a feature-packed bread maker with 32 different programs, including special options for gluten-free, rye and sourdough. 2 temperature sensors, one inside and one out, so that it can gauge the ambient temperature. An automatic yeast and raisin dispenser, delayed start, and 2 different kneading blades. The second one of which is for artisan style kneading so that you can make rye bread. In addition, there are 3 different options for both loaf size and crust colour. And you've probably noticed it's also an awful lot bigger than the Morphy Richards, which means you're going to have to think about where you're going to store it and or where you're going to locate it on your worktop. Now, those of you who follow me on social media may have seen the daily updates that I've been doing about testing these bread makers, and you might know that I had mixed success with this machine, particularly at the beginning of the week. Now, 2 of the loaves came out with sunken tops, and the rye loaf actually wasn't fully cooked through, despite the fact that I followed the recipes and the method to the letter and used the same batch of yeast, which was producing great results in the Morphy Richards machine. So I'm very grateful to Liz, who commented to say that she'd discovered via the Panasonic Facebook group that the quantities of some of the recipes in the Panasonic recipe book were incorrect. And in fact, when I tested this bread maker again with the white loaf recipe from the Morphy Richards book, the results of the loaf were perfect. Interestingly, this Panasonic has a 4-hour basic cooking mode rather than Morphy Richards' 3-hour program, and the loaf that I did in both came out bigger from the Panasonic with that longer cooking cycle, but you wouldn't know that unless you were looking at the 2 side by side. So one of the main features on the Panasonic is the compartment at the top where you can add yeast and mix-ins separately. I have mixed views about this feature. So let's start off talking about the raisin and nuts dispenser. I made raisin rolls using this method and it turned out brilliantly, with the raisins distributed evenly through the dough, which would be very hard to do if you didn't have that automatic dispenser. If you were to do raisin rolls in the Morphy Richards, you'd have to make sure that you hear the beep midway through the kneading and then manually lift the lid and add the raisins. And that's going to be tricky unless you spend a lot of time standing over the bread maker to make sure you get that exact moment. But I'm less convinced about the usefulness of the yeast dispenser in the lid of the Panasonic. It's supposed to be there so that yeast can be added at the right moment in the bread making program. But I've been making bread by hand for years. I've never once come across a recipe which requires you to add yeast midway through making bread. And as a sanity check, I did ask a few other people in my life who bake if they'd ever heard of this, and they had the same response as me. Now, I could see an argument for it if you were setting the bread maker up for a delayed start and you didn't want the yeast to activate before the program started several hours after you left the machine. But the best way around that, which is incorporated into the Morphy Richards recipe, is to add the water first into the bread pan, then add the yeast very last moment on top of the flour so that the 2 don't mix until the machine starts. Also, having a separate dispenser means that you have to add the yeast after you've closed the lid on the main compartment, which personally for me in a busy family house is just asking for trouble. Because the moment I close that lid, if I get distracted, there is a real danger that I'm not going to add the yeast. In fact, I was so paranoid about doing this all week that I became completely focused on that at the expense of other things, and I ended up messing up in a completely different way. One of the batches of bread I did, I put in, and 4 hours later got this. I remembered the yeast and I forgot to put the dough blade in instead. And that kind of brings me very neatly to what I think is one of the downsides of this model. Although the control panel tells you where you are in the bread making program, and that is supposed to be a premium feature, it doesn't have a window, so you can't actually see how far along you are. And of course, if I'd had a window, I would have realised my mistake with the batch that was missing the blade earlier on. So here are a few things to consider when you're looking at bread makers. I think a delayed start is essential. It's pointless having a bread maker unless you've got one. Ideally, you want the option to bake a loaf up to 2 pounds in size to give you the flexibility to either bake for a family or for guests. And if it's only you or you and your other half during the week, you also want the option to bake a smaller loaf. Different crust options are good to have, and it's a personal thing, but I do like having a window so that I can keep an eye on my loaf as it bakes. So Panasonic do make an awful lot of bread makers, and this top of the range one is really for people who want to be able to make different types of specialist bread and to explore that next level of bread baking. I'm also going to include some links down below in the description to some of their other models which aren't quite so expensive. But of these two models, my vote would go for the Morphy Richards because I think it's really good value for money.